and good afternoon. I am Dr. Saadat Ali. I am assistant professor at Asian Institute of Medical Sciences, Hyderabad. I am a consultant gastroenterologist. Thank you. Okay, from switching on from the liver transplantation, we would be moving on to Symposium 12, that is, be focusing on autoimmune and drug-induced liver diseases. And we'll have 4 presentations during this session. Um, this session would be chaired by our distinguished panelists, Dr. Noman Zakir, who is Chair of Hepatology, Consultant Gastroenterologist at Pakistan Kidney and Liver Institute, Lahore, and Dr. Kashif Malik, who is Professor of Medicine at Sheikh Zayed Postgraduate Institute, Lahore, and Dr. Shakil Mirza, who is Consultant Gastroenterologist working in Rawalpindi, Dr. Abdul Qayyum Memon, Professor of Medicine at People's Medical University, Nawab Shah, and Dr. Om Prakash, who is Associate Professor, Consultant Gastroenterologist at Aga Khan University, Karachi. So we'll have 4 talks focusing on autoimmune and drug-induced liver diseases, and we'll be starting with our first speaker, Dr. Motaz Fateh Saad, our distinguished international faculty, a consultant gastroenterologist working at Mubarak Al Kabir Hospital, Kuwait. And the topic of discussion would be autoimmune hepatitis with and without cirrhosis, current and future treatments.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I'd like to thank organizers for giving me a chance to speak in this very prestigious meeting with this very elite speakers. I am Dr. Motaz Fateh Saad, a consultant GI in hepatology in Kuwait. And today I'm going to talk about an interesting hepatology subject, which is autoimmune liver disease, the current and the future treatment. I have nothing to disclose concerning this lecture. So these are the topics I will try to cover today. It's a very short time, I'll try to cover as much as I can. So for epidemiology of AIH, as you know, it's a non-resolving chronic liver disease that occurs in both sexes and affects mainly women. Incidence of AIH is increasing, as you can see here in this graph, since 1990 till 2015. It's almost double, and prevalence of AIH ranges from 15 to 25 cases per 100,000 inhabitants in Europe, and is increasing in both women and men. It occurs in all ethnic groups and in all age groups. It's had bimodal distribution, usually peaks around puberty and between 4th and 6th decade, and significant proportion of patients are above 65 years of age at presentation. And again, we stress that it can affect all population at all age groups. So clinical spectrum, it's very wide. It's a bit tricky disease, so it has very wide spectrum of clinical presentation. So it should be considered in any patient with acute or chronic liver disease, particularly in the context of hypergammaglobulinemia. And prompt and timely diagnosis is crucial, as untreated AIH has a high mortality and morbidity even. 1/3 of adult and almost half of child patients with AIH are early cirrhotics at presentation. And acute presentation of AIH can occur either as an acute exacerbation of previously undiagnosed or as a new onset acute AIH, and is associated with a broad variety of other autoimmune disease, like rheumatoid arthritis, for example. All children with AIH should undergo MRCP to exclude primary or autoimmune sclerosing cholangitis. Also, patients with cirrhosis should undergo liver ultrasound 6 monthly for HCC screening. After 1 year, 60% of patients will relapse, and after 3 years, 80%. Patients will relapse, unfortunately, and those patients who were combination therapy at time of drug withdrawal, they have higher risk of relapse and shorter time to relapse. So it's almost universal on withdrawal of immunosuppressive therapy, and even if we stop treatment, treatment, we should be patients should be under close monitoring lifelong. So it is also simplified approach. How can we follow up patients who achieve remission? So those achieve remission, and I mean normal ALT and normal IgG. Then we reduce immune suppression stabilize, and if they are stable in remission for 3 years after doing a biopsy, make sure there's no histological activity, so we can stop treatment. And if they are stable remission without treatment, so we monitor them lifelong every 3 months for 1 year, then every 6 months. But if they relapse after treatment withdrawal, so we will reinduce remission again with prednisolone at induction dose, and again we'll add azacitidine as if we're treating a new patient. Just a few words about special population. Those patients who are pregnant ladies, just to say a few words. So AIH can manifest within a few months after pregnancy or delivery, and it can also manifest during pregnancy, although it's rare. Management is exactly as if we are treating patients who are not pregnant, but we have to know a few points that the risk for mother and baby are higher when treatment is stopped and these flares occurs than on continued treatment. So you'll find some ladies who are afraid of treatment. You can tell them if you don't get treatment and if your disease get a flare, the chance of miscarriage is much higher than if you get treatment. And our treatment is usually safe pregnancy, except MMF, which is not advised at all to be used during pregnancy. And usually activity is usually milder during pregnancy, and some flare after delivery are common. And we can think about transient increase in immune suppression dose after delivery. And also, it's very important to know that we are not treating the liver. We are dealing with the patient himself. So we don't want to treat an organ and to hurt other organ. So we should think about bone, because of the long-standing course of treatment of steroid can induce osteoporosis. So we should do an BMD at the onset of initiation of steroid therapy, and we have to do it yearly, and we have to give patients supplementation with vitamin D and adequate calcium. And also we should give vaccination against hepatitis A, B, and yearly influenza vaccination. What are budesonide? Budesonide is very, very nice drug. It's a synthetic steroid, which have very minimal systemic absorption and side effects. So efficacy and safety, budesonide, which has 90% first-pass effect on the liver in combination with azacitidine, was demonstrated in a randomized trial of newly diagnosed AIH with target remission after 6 months. Those patients receiving budesonide combined with weight-based AZA achieved respiratory remission after 6 months more frequently, 60% versus only 39%. To those who received prednisolone, with fewer steroid-specific side effects compared to prednisolone combined with weight-based azacitidine. So it's very efficient and very safe medication. But patients with acute renal failure or those who are cirrhotic were not included in this randomized trial of budesonide. Patients with cirrhosis should not receive budesonide because portosystemic shunting may reduce drug efficacy and promote steroid-specific side effects by allowing budesonide to bypass the liver. But those who fail to respond to budesonide are not candidate to receive those who didn't respond to prednisolone are not candidate to receive budesonide. So budesonide is not a salvage therapy. I mean, it's not a first-line therapy. It is an alternative first-line therapy, and I use it a lot with my patients, and I see very nice results. What about the future? What do we expect to see soon, maybe in treatment of AIH? So what about, first is about anti-TNF. We all know it in treatment mainly of IBD, like infliximab. They are known to cause liver injury and may even cause drug-induced AIH-like injury. But at the same time, anti-TNF antibodies may also have a therapeutic role in AIH. The largest single-center retrospective analysis of infliximab therapy in AIH, 11 difficult-to-treat adult patients, including 7 who are cirrhotic, received infusion of infliximab at dose of 5 milligram per kilogram. 6 of them have normalized ALT and IgG level, but 7 patients develop infection complications, and 1 patient stopped treatment due to allergic reaction and incomplete response. Another single center retrospective analysis in 11 pediatric patients and adolescents with IBD and AIH, including only 1 with AIH and 9 with overlap AIH with PSC. They received also 5 milligram per kilogram infliximab to treat IBD. The 3 patients were later treated with adalimumab after infliximab intolerance or failure. The IBD improved in most patients, and liver enzymes improved in 5 patients from this 11 patients. but the heterogeneity of population and its principal goal of treating the IBD precluded conclusion about the role of anti-NF alpha agents in treating AIH, and the weak evidence on efficacy and the increased risk of infection, especially patients who are cirrhotic, do not justify use of anti-NF agents as second-line treatment so far. What about anti-CD20? We all know rituximab, which is widely used by our colleagues in rheumatology and in nephrology and even in oncology. As you know, it's an antibody direct against B-cell surface, against CD20, and has been used to treat 2 children with AH who were not responding to a combination of steroid and AZA, and both normalized ALT and AST level. Rituximab also has been infused in 6 adult patients with AIH, including 3 with aracyclovir intolerance, and 3 who were non-responders to steroid, AZA, and MMF. And serum ALT and IgG level improved significantly in all patients, and biochemical remission even was achieved in 2/3 of the patients. Evidence favoring use of B-cell depleting antibodies is limited so far and does not justify their use as second-line therapy, but now there is prospective randomized clinical trials ongoing that evaluate ianalumab, which is anti-CD20, in patients with AIH who are non-responders to or intolerant to steroids and aracyclovir. Orthothiogonines now are being tried. It's directly metabolized to GTN, which is metabolically active metabolite of arathiogonine, and the inclusion of thiogonines as a second-line treatment of AIH await further demonstration of its safety and efficacy among center trials. So last point about a new entity, an immune-mediated liver disease. It's called immune checkpoint inhibitor hepatitis. So as you know now, immuno-oncology therapies are being increasingly used as principal pharmacotherapy in cancer treatment. They are licensed for many tumors and now being even evaluated for HCC and cholangiocarcinoma. And due to the mode of action, the blockage of T-cell inhibition, this new class of drugs have a spectrum of adverse actions, specifically the induction of autoimmune-like disease. So an autoimmune-like DILI has been observed in almost 5% of patients under checkpoint blockade and developed predominantly within the first 6 to 12 weeks from starting treatment, and the immediate application of systemic steroid and permanent discontinuation of immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy are recommended for any ALT increase more than grade 3. So to summarize and take home message, autoimmune hepatitis is a rare disease affecting mostly females but can present at any age. Biopsy is important to reach definite diagnosis. Most of patients respond to steroid therapy, but unfortunately relapse after stopping treatment is universal. Budesonide plus arathiogonine is a very efficient first-line therapy with much less steroid-specific side effects. Anti-NF alpha and anti-CD20 can be promising medications to treat AIH. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Saad, for the wonderful presentation. We'll take on the questions after all the presentations are over, and we request all the participants to please post your questions as we go on. We move on to our second presentation, which would be by Dr. Masood Siddique, who is Head of Medicine at Foundation University Medical College, Islamabad, and he is the ex-president of PSSLD. Dr. Masood Siddique. And Dr. Masood would be presenting primary biliary cholangitis and primary
Chairperson, co-chairs, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely grateful to the organizing committee who gave me this opportunity. And I would like to appreciate the efforts which have been made by the organizing committee for this meeting. It was a daunting task, and congratulations to Professor Zagam Abbas and his team for doing a wonderful work. And coming to my presentation, there's primary biliary cholangitis and primary biliary, which used to be called as primary biliary cirrhosis before, and now it's called primary biliary cholangitis and primary sclerosing cholangitis. I have got only 10 minutes to cover these two topics. So ladies and gentlemen, primary biliary cholangitis or primary biliary cirrhosis, it may be an asymptomatic disease or a symptomatic disease, and it may present with as an advanced chronic liver disease, and there may be patients who may develop hepatocellular carcinoma. But a typical patient who is symptomatic could present with fatigue, pruritus, may have hyperpigmentation, hepatosplenomegaly, xanthelasma, jaundice, and right upper quadrant pain. Certainly, the pruritus which they have, it is very, very severe. And there will be patients who may not be having any symptoms. So diagnosis of primary biliary cholangitis is established in presence of two of the following three criteria, that there is alkaline phosphatase and gamma GT is raised, the antimitochondrial antibodies are present, and there may be other antibodies which may be primary biliary cholangitis specific antinuclear antibody. There is a histological finding of non-suppurative destructive cholangitis. If we have to make a definitive diagnosis, all the three must be present. And if we have to make a probable diagnosis, then 2 out of 3 should be present. And coming to the lab work, that increased serum alkaline phosphatase or gamma GT is the hallmark. But when we are making the diagnosis, we must exclude the possibility of cholestatic drug-induced liver injury, which could be present in many patients. And it's also critical to exclude intra and extrahepatic biliary obstruction as a cause of cholestasis. Ultrasonography abdomen is recommended, and MRCP will be helpful in quite a few patients. In primary biliary cholangitis or primary biliary cirrhosis, there is a mild elevation of transaminases. Usually it's not very high, and these patients may present with progressive hepatic dysfunction and hyperbilirubinemia like any chronic liver disease patient. Antibodies are extremely important, and antimitochondrial antibody and its subtypes. And there may be PBC-specific types of ANA, like anti-GP120 and anti-SP100 and P62 and others. Antimitochondrial antibody positivity that is observed in more than 90 to 95% of patients with primary biliary cholangitis. And ladies and gentlemen, this is highly specific. There are 9 subtypes, 4 of which are associated with primary biliary cirrhosis, that is M2, M4, M8, and M9. In 5 to 10% of patients of primary biliary cholangitis, antimitochondrial antibodies are absent. And to diagnose them, it's really a challenge. So in these patients, we can test for PBC-specific autoantibodies. And for patients who are antimitochondrial antibody negative, it would be worthwhile to do MRCP to rule out the possibility of a sclerosing cholangitis. In addition, in 30 to 50% of patients with primary biliary cholangitis, they have got detectable ANA. And coming to the imaging, abdominal ultrasound will help us in diagnosing cholestasis and liver malignancies. And we can find signs of advanced primary biliary cholangitis also while doing ultrasonography. Lymphadenopathy is present in 62 to 88% of patients with primary biliary cholangitis. It may be a hilar lymphadenopathy. It may be periportal lymphadenopathy. It may be portocaval lymphadenopathy and other areas. Ladies and gentlemen, MRCP in cholestatic patient is safe and accurate imaging technique, and it will certainly exclude the possibility of intra and extrahepatic obstruction. And it will be possible to rule out possibility of primary or secondary sclerosing cholangitis. EUS is clinically equivalent to MRCP, and transient elastography or shear wave elastography or fibroscan is a non-invasive tool to evaluate the degree of liver fibrosis. MRI can be performed in the patients. They will show hypertrophy of the left lobe of the liver or the caudate lobe, which is certainly not specific to primary biliary cholangitis. You can see hollow sign, which shows areas of fibrous deposition around the portal tribes and is thought to have some specificity to primary biliary cholangitis. And finally, MRI with MRCP will differentiate advanced stages of primary biliary cholangitis from primary sclerosing cholangitis. What is the role of histology? Liver biopsy is no longer considered a requirement to make the diagnosis of primary biliary cholangitis. Ladies and gentlemen, but it is required in following situations like overlap with autoimmune hepatitis, and when alternative diagnosis such as small duct primary sclerosing cholangitis is considered, and if serum alkaline phosphatase is 5 times the limit of normal and in an AMA negative primary biliary cholangitis. So coming to the treatment, that what therapies are available for these patients, and what can slow the progression of the disease, that is ursodeoxycholic acid, obeticholic acid, budesonide, and others. Fibric acid derivatives, people have used immunomodulators and stem cell transplantation also. Ursodeoxycholic acid is recommended for all patients primary biliary cholangitis by ASLD and EASL and is usually continued for rest of the life. Data suggests that the optimum dose is 13 to 50 milligram per kilogram body weight, which can be given as a single dose or in divided doses. Ursodeoxycholic is a very safe drug, and it can be used in early pregnancy and even in ladies who are breastfeeding, but we certainly need more data about it. Obeticholic acid, it was approved by US and European Union in 2016. It is a bile acid derivative and FXR agonist, and it reduces the synthesis of new bile acids. So this is how the bile acid induced toxicity of the biliary tree that is reduced. So obeticholic acid also has got anti-inflammatory and anti-fibrotic properties. If we look at the review of the studies on obeticholic acid, daily doses of obeticholic acid ranging from 10 to 50 milligram has been used. Looking at the response, it's significantly reduced the level of alkaline phosphatase gamma GT and ALT. The incidence and severity of pruritus was lowest among patients who received 10 milligram per day obeticholic acid, and biochemical response to obeticholic acid were maintained 12 months. People have used other drugs, and they have used budesonide 9 milligram per day, and it showed significant reduction in serum alkaline phosphatase, and it was used as an add-on therapy. Methotrexate is also used by patients, but it did not demonstrate any additional benefit. There were some studies where people used benzafibrate 400 milligram per day. There was normalization of alkaline phosphatase. It was reported in 45% of patients who did not respond to ursodeoxycholic acid. People have used rituximab, and there was a modest improvement in alkaline phosphatase level, but there was a significant decrease in R2 antibody production. Other immunomodulated drugs are also under evaluation in primary biliary cholangitis. People have used stem cell transplantation. In 10 patients, and there was a significant improvement in alkaline phosphatase and other transaminases. But long-term effects of stem cell transplantation in primary biliary cholangitis are not known. Ladies and gentlemen, coming to the conclusion of primary biliary cholangitis, it is a progressive autoimmune cholestatic disorder which is characterized by circulating antimitochondrial antibodies and non-suppurative cholangitis. Increase in serum alkaline phosphatase is the hallmark antimitochondrial antibody positivity that is observed in more than 90 to 95% of patients with primary biliary cholangitis, and it is highly specific to this disease. MRCP in cholestatic patient is safe and accurate imaging method for intra and extra hepatic biliary tree. Liver biopsy is no longer considered a requirement to make the diagnosis of primary biliary cholangitis. Ursodeoxycholic acid is recommended for all patients with primary biliary cholangitis by ASLD and EASL, and it's continued for life. Daily doses of obeticholic acid ranging from 10 to 50 milligram significantly reduce the level of alkaline phosphatase, gamma GT, and ALT. And now let's move to primary sclerosing cholangitis, and which I would finish for Beverly in next 2 to 3 minutes time. And we can see normal bile ducts and hepatic ducts and cystic duct. And on the other side, there is inflammation of the ducts, which has led to formation of strictures. There's a beaded appearance, and there is a dilatation of the ducts as well. And this is how it looks on ERCP. On the one side, there's a normal bile duct, and you can see beading and dilatations and strictures in sclerosing cholangitis. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a chronic progressive fibro-obliterative bile duct inflammation, and it can involve any part of the biliary tree. The incidence of the disease is not very high. Men are more likely to be affected, up to 70%, and many of them, they will be having inflammatory bowel disease, and most of them having ulcerative colitis. Prevalence of primary sclerosing cholangitis may be increased in first degree relatives. It may be a small duct disease with typical histological features and with a normal cholangiogram. In a large duct primary sclerosing cholangitis, characteristic strictures of biliary tree can be detected by cholangiography. These patients may present with non-specific findings. There may be abdominal pain, pruritus, and patients usually have ulcerative colitis. Most patients with primary sclerosing cholangitis, they present with a cholestatic pattern. Rarely patient will be diagnosed primary sclerosing cholangitis after a bout of cholangitis or after presenting with end-stage liver disease, or they may come with cholangiocarcinoma. We have to differentiate between primary sclerosing cholangitis and IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis. In IgG4 related cholangitis, there is a dilatation and there is a confluent strictures. Strictures of lower common bile duct are present, while in primary sclerosing cholangitis, there is a band-like stricture, there is a beaded appearance, there is a prune tree appearance, and diverticulum-like outpouching. And if we perform the lab tests, certainly alkaline phosphatase and gamma GT are raised, serum aminotransaminases are typically raised but not very high, and albumin is usually normal in these patients. And if we get a patient who has got a cholestatic biochemical profile and we perform an ultrasound examination and antimitochondrial antibody, and if these are non-diagnostic, we must proceed with MRCP. And it may be diagnostic of large duct primary sclerosing cholangitis, but if it is non-diagnostic, then we have to do ERCP on these patients. And we may be able to diagnose large duct primary sclerosing cholangitis, but if ERCP is normal, then we should proceed with liver biopsy to diagnose small duct primary sclerosing cholangitis. Ursodeoxycholic acid in dose of 20 to 30 milligram per kilogram per day may be beneficial. Corticosteroids and other immunosuppressants are usually not helpful until unless there is an overlap syndrome or IgG4 associated primary sclerosing cholangitis. Episodes of cholangitis should be managed with intravenous antibiotics like ciprofloxacin and vancomycin, and they will need endoscopic therapy. Pruritus can be managed with cholestyramine, or we can add rifampicin also if the response is not good. And in patient with osteopenia, we can use calcium vitamin D, and patient with osteoporosis, they will certainly need bisphosphonates. And ERCP can be performed to dilate and stent dominant strictures. And patients who have got an advanced disease, they certainly should be referred for liver transplantation. And coming to the conclusion of primary sclerosing cholangitis is a cholestatic liver disease characterized by inflammation. It can result in formation of multifocal biliary strictures. Though the etiology of the disease remains elusive, evidence suggests the role of genetic and immunological factors. Disease progression varies from patient to patient. The disease can result in complications of end-stage liver disease, portal hypertension, cholangitis, or development of cholangiocarcinoma. While the majority of patients with primary sclerosing cholangitis have a developed inflammatory bowel disease, 70 to 90%, mainly ulcerative colitis, a minority of patients with inflammatory bowel disease will develop primary sclerosing cholangitis. There is no specific therapy which is of proven benefit, and treatment is supportive. Liver transplantation is a viable option and should be considered early for those that have complication of the disease. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Masood, for the wonderful presentation. You had to condense two topics in this much small time. We move on to the third presentation, and we'll have Dr. Nadeem A. Tihami, who is a consultant hepatologist and hepatobiliary physician from University Hospital Southampton, UK, and he'll be talking on a relatively newer disease entity, a rare one, IgG4 related diseases with hepatobiliary involvement, the art of dealing with a multifaceted disease. Dr. Tihami, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. Could you please allow me to share my screen?
Yes, Dr. Nadeem, please. IT, please allow him, promote him so that he can share his screen. Okay. Okay. Dr. Nadeem, your slides are uploaded over here. You just need to move your slides by using the arrow at the bottom of your slides.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you for the invitation. I am an endohepatologist based in Southampton. My interests include autoimmune liver and pancreas related liver diseases. In the next 10 to 15 minutes, I will take you through some of the case vignettes, which should highlight the spectrum of this disorder. We will touch upon the IgG4 related disease pathogenesis, some clues to the etiology, and then we'll discuss the treatment of IgG4 related disease in view of the UAG guidelines. So the first case that I would like to share with you is of a 28-year-old lady. She presented with painful jaundice with elevated liver enzymes. She had eosinophilia. Her complement levels were low. Unsurprisingly, her CA99 and IgG4 level was normal. We did not have an IgE at that level. The initial imaging with the ultrasound scan showed dilated intra and extrahepatic ducts. A CT showed a diffusely enlarged pancreas. She went on to have an ERCP because she required biliary decompression and stenting was performed. Brushings and ampullary biopsy did not give us the diagnosis in this case. So she went on to have an EUS and pancreatic biopsy was taken, which confirmed the diagnosis of IgG4-related autoimmune pancreatitis. She was started on steroids and improved rapidly. The question that I would have asked if it was an interactive section, that would she benefit from immunosuppression? She was trying to conceive at that time and was not keen on taking any immunosuppressant. So we didn't give any immunosuppression. When she was last followed up a month ago, was still doing quite well, having had a baby recently. So that was quite a happy ending. So the next case was of a 68-year-old man who was diagnosed with diabetes following presentation with weight loss. His liver enzymes was normal. He had a family history of pancreatic cancer, so went on to have a CT scan. Now, apologies, the two images are overlapping each other, but initial image showed focal dilatation of the pancreatic tail. He had normal liver blood tests. His IgG4 level was 2 times the upper limit of normal with raised IgE. Complements and eosinophils were normal. He was given treatment for his diabetes, and on a subsequent scan, his changes had resolved. He didn't require any treatment with steroids because essentially he was asymptomatic from what was thought of IgG4-related disease at the time. Now, moving forward, 2 years forward, he presented with painless jaundice. And at this stage, he had a stricture in the hilum, which was brushed, had a stenting performed. He also had cholangioscopy, which showed a stricture around the hilum. Biopsies were taken, but in this case, the diagnosis came from the ampullary biopsies. He was started on steroids and improved remarkably. So the third case was a bit of a challenge because he presented with non-specific symptoms of tiredness and lassitude. He had goiter, had an FNA it was euthyroid. He had an FNA of his goiter, which did not give us any diagnosis. He went on to have some further imaging. There was a concern with the underlying possibility of malignancy. So he had a PET scan. Again, apologies for the overlapping of the images, but there was an increased metabolic activity around his aorta, in his lung nodules, and in the tail of the pancreas. That was biopsies which gave us the diagnosis. So this case essentially highlighted the importance of considering other investigations, including PET, which can help to determine the site of the active disease and also assess some subclinical organ involvement. It also helps us in targeting the biopsies, and radiological follow-up is necessary to assess the response to the treatment. However, these findings are non-specific and clearly involves a huge radiation dose. And what we don't understand is the relevance of the subclinical disease. He was put on steroids for subsequently immunosuppression and has been doing really well. So these three cases would hopefully have highlighted this different spectrum of this disease process. But we all know that they differ in age, gender, ethnicity, their biochemical, serological profile, and also the time to presentation. In terms of the cluster of IgG4 related disease, if we focus on the HBB cluster, what we see that there's a major involvement of pancreas in most of the cases. Biliary involvement is second most commonest, but then we also have to look at some of the other glands involvement, including submandibular gland, which highlights the importance of detailed examination when we are seeing these patients. So about quarter of a cohort will be with HBB cluster. It's a male predominant disease seen in 6-7 decades of life. Time to diagnose is variable, and in some cases could easily take up to 3 years. Now, elevated level of serum IgG help in diagnosing this condition. While we are seeing these patients, as the earlier slide alluded to, it's important to examine their head and neck, looking for the enlargement of the submandibular gland. We recommend doing a full body scan to exclude underlying malignancy. And in cases where biliary intervention is required, it's important to do the MRI scan to delineate the anatomy. Let's focus on the autoimmune pancreatitis, which is the commonest presentation. These patients can present as typical pancreatitis or could also be painful or painless jaundice. In patients presenting with acutely, we would suggest amylase to diagnose, but then there are some clues to the etiology or diagnosis that would show that could be seen in the full blood count, such as eosinophilia. We recommend doing serum IgG and IgG4 and IgG ratio because even the serum IgG4 to IgG ratio can also help in diagnosis. Complement levels are usually low, and in patients presenting with a relapse or and end up developing chronic pancreatitis, looking for features of pancreas exocrine insufficiency and HbA1c are also useful. There are two broad types of this disease process. It's important to differentiate, the reason being that the type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis are the one which could present with frequent relapses, unlike type 2. There's a systemic disease involvement seen mostly in type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis, but inflammatory bowel disease is usually seen in patients with type 2 autoimmune pancreatitis. Now, serum IgG4, which we rely upon a lot, is not seen elevated in type 2 autoimmune pancreatitis. It is seen elevated in type 1. However, up to 30% patients, even when type 1 autoimmune pancreatitis, can have a normal IgG4. So one of the practice or take-home point from this slide is that we cannot solely rely on IgG4 for making this diagnosis. How do we diagnose this condition? There are different criteria available. This is quite useful criteria used by Mayo Clinic, which is quite clinically and practically relevant. That relies on histology. Now, histology, again, different features slightly differ in both autoimmune type 1 and type 2 pancreatitis. But what we are looking for is storiform fibrosis, obliterative phlebitis, and lymphocytic plasma cell infiltrate, and the ratio of IgG4 over IgG4 plasma cells. Now, most of these features are present in type 1 and type 2. These features might be present, but the findings might be patchy. The other features that we have to look for are imaging, serology, other organ involvement, but most importantly is the response to steroid, which determines the course of the disease. Imaging features are quite useful. The disease from parenchymal changes that we see could be diffuse or focal. In patients who have focal autoimmune pancreatitis presenting as a mass lesion, what we tend to expect, if the duct peripheral to the mass lesion is of normal caliber, that would point toward differential diagnosis, which will include autoimmune pancreatitis and also cases like lymphoma. Ductal features are variable, but as I suggested, that if the duct peripheral to the focal mass lesion is of normal caliber, that would point toward this diagnosis. But you also have to look at other features such as narrowing, vanishing of the duct, or in some cases, skip lesions. While looking at the images of a patient with autoimmune pancreatitis, it's also important to exclude underlying malignancy and some other features which might point toward the diagnosis of autoimmune pancreatitis, such as loss of indentation in the parenchyma of the kidney. Sclerosing cholangitis is usually seen as an other organ manifestations in patients with autoimmune pancreatitis, can present with obstructive jaundice with elevated liver enzymes, but mostly the transaminases are less than 3 times the upper limit of normal. As Professor Siddique earlier alluded to, there are four different types of IgG4-related sclerosing cholangitis. Type 1 is usually the extrahepatic ductal stricture. Type 2 is intrahepatic ductal stricture, and type 3 is mostly hilar stricture. But in cases of type 3 and type 4, for some reason, I can't seem to control that slide. However, it's important to exclude the underlying sclerosing cholangitis and cholangiocarcinoma in these cases. Now, PSC is regarded as a black box in the field of hepatology, and IgG4-related sclerosing cholangitis masquerading as PSC has not helped. What we are looking for are the typical features of bleeding in patients with PSC. Those features are usually not seen in patients with IgG4-related sclerosing cholangitis. It's the histology which clinches the diagnosis in most of these cases. It's important to note that although ursodeoxycholic acid is not an evidence-based treatment for PSC, however, liver biochemistry tends to improve in patients with the PSC, which doesn't happen in patients with IgG4-related sclerosing cholangitis. It, however, remains a mind-boggling process. Now, this condition, IgG4-related hepatopathy, is something which is not very well understood. We know that liver is involved concurrently in patients with autoimmune pancreatitis, but patients presenting with IgG4-related hepatopathy could be characterized by as a focal, well-circumscribed lesions, which could mimic as a malignant lesion. The biopsy again clinches the diagnosis, where we tend to see a lot of plasmacytic infiltrates and immunostaining, where the IgG4 to IgG plasma cell ratio could help in determining the diagnosis. There's a different criteria, as I earlier alluded to, high sort criteria. There's a Japanese criteria, but the primary aim of these criteria is to exclude underlying malignancy, and secondary aim is to confirm the diagnosis, which mostly rely on histological finding. Clinical features and IgG4 level needs to be taken into account, but on their own cannot be relied upon on making the diagnosis. Why is this diagnosis? So this is clearly one of the most important slides from my presentation. What it tells us that higher level of IgG4 helps tend to be more specific toward the diagnosis. However, normal IgG4 level can also be seen in patients with autoimmune pancreatitis and IgG4-related disease. Likewise, IgG4 levels can be elevated in patients with malignancy and primary sclerosing cholangitis in at least up to 10% of the cases in this series published by Dr. Emma Culver and the group. I'll spend the last few minutes on the treatment. Treatment is on induction, maintenance, and relying and assessing patients who are at high risk of relapse. Who should we be treating? All the symptomatic patients. In patients who are asymptomatic, and if there's a concern of underlying diagnosis, especially patients presenting with a focal mass lesion, steroid trial can be given, and if the mass melts away quickly, that would help us in excluding the underlying malignancy. Biopsy remains the cornerstone in the diagnosis in malignancy and IgG4-related disease. In patients who have persistent cholestatic liver biochemistry, that is also a group of patients who would benefit from treatment. However, there is no relevant data to support the treatment in autoimmune pancreatitis in patients who do not have any symptoms. One of the most important practice points from my presentation, that is the steroid treatment should be started typically at 30 to 40 milligrams per day, but unlike most other autoimmune condition, treatment duration should be minimum 3 months, and up to 6 months is also recommended, because the lower dose or the shorter duration is associated with increased relapse rate. The relapse can happen up to 10 years after the original presentation. Therefore, close monitoring and long-term follow-up is recommended. We know that in patients presenting with relapse, again, we cannot rely on symptoms on serology, and therefore, even in these cases, histology might be necessary. Who are the patients who will relapse? Now, we earlier briefly mentioned that the autoimmune type 1 pancreatitis are the one who have a higher risk of relapse, and patients who have sclerosing cholangitis with proximal biliary disease are another group of patients who will be at risk of relapse. There are some other features, but they are inconsistently associated with the increased risk rate. In terms of the maintenance options, I'm conscious of the time, therefore I'll just skip over the next few slides, but we know our maintenance option of steroids. So this study, in this randomized controlled trial, they looked at two arms. One was a long-term follow-up, and in the other arm, they stopped the treatment after 26 weeks. And what they saw in the maintenance group, the relapse-free survival was much better than the patient who had a treatment only for 26 weeks. But this study was closed earlier. It was an underpowered study, and there was clearly risk associated with the steroids, long-term effects of the steroids. Thiopurines, azathioprine and mercaptopurine, there is no randomized controlled trial available. From UK experience, we know that only 1/3 of the patient will respond, 1/3 will not be able to tolerate this medication, and the other third will end up relapsing with this medication. There isn't a study looking at role of mycophenolate alone. However, this study where they looked at the role of mycophenolate with steroids compared with steroids alone showed that there was an increase, there's a relapse-free survival was higher with mycophenolate. Relapse-free remission, sorry, not survival. The cyclophosphamide has also been assessed again in conjunction with the prednisolone, seemed to give us a better relapse-free remission. Now, rituximab seems to be our favorite drug these days. And the reason is because this appears to be effective both in combination and on its own, even for the induction and the maintenance treatment of patients presenting with relapse. So the treatment options in conclusion for disease relapse is one, after confirming the diagnosis, is induction either with steroids or with rituximab, and following on, these patients can be either maintained on low dose steroids, some immunomodulators, which could include rituximab or rituximab alone. This is, however, an area where we still have lots of knowledge gaps, where we need to have improved biomarkers for both diagnosis, disease classification, and assessing the relapse rates. And we do need a technology where we can safely obtain the tissue diagnosis. There are lots of concern when we talk to the endosonographer about taking pancreas biopsy in these cases. We do need some novel predictors for the disease relapse, and we need controlled clinical trials to guide us treatment, to guide our therapeutic decisions. So, ladies and gentlemen, and Mr. Chairperson, for the key home messages for my slide would be that the diagnosis is complex. We do need to take into account all these diagnostic criteria available, mainly the Mayo high sort criteria. Steroids is the predominant treatment and the cornerstone of treatment, both for the induction and patients presenting with the relapse. IgG4 cannot be relied upon entirely for the diagnosis. However, the level monitoring could help us in monitoring the response of the disease on steroids and other treatment. That's all I wanted to say, and thank you very much for listening and giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Tehami, for the excellent presentation. And I would like to remind the participants to please post their questions, and we'll take up the questions at the end of the session. We move on to the next presentation, and it would be by Dr. Shahab Abid, who is Professor of Medicine and Gastroenterology, Head Section of Gastroenterology at Aga Khan University Hospital, Karachi. And the topic would be drug-induced liver injury, recent advances in diagnosis and treatment. Professor Shahab.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in Pakistan Society of Study of Liver Disease 14th Annual Conference. The topic of my presentation is drug-induced liver injury. So drug-induced liver injury, there is no conflict of interest. It is defined as a history of exposure to medicine, herbal or dietary supplement followed by derangement of liver function. It is basically of two types. One is intrinsic DILI, which is dose dependent, predictable, reproducible in preclinical models. The other one is the idiosyncratic DILI, which is rare but responsible for 10 to 15% cases of acute liver failure, and it's almost impossible to predict. There is a variable latency of onset and lack of clear dose dependency. In last year New England Journal of Medicine, there is a very comprehensive review article, and they have categorized drug-induced liver injury into three groups. Direct hepatotoxicity, which is a common one, and it is predictable, dose dependent. The classical example is acetaminophen. Idiosyncratic hepatotoxicity, which is rare and it is not dose dependent. The classical example is amoxicillin calvinate and other cephalosporins and isoniazid. And there is third category, which is called the indirect hepatotoxicity. Its frequency is intermediate. It is partially predictable. It may be a delayed in onset, and the classical examples are antineoplastic agents and glucocorticoids. Now let's see what are the top 10 therapeutic classes to cause drug-induced liver injury. The top 3 candidates in this particular group is cardiovascular agent, herbal or dietary supplement, and the topmost you can guess would be, yes, this is antimicrobial. Almost half of the individuals with drug-induced liver injuries are suffering from drug-induced liver injury caused by antimicrobials. And this is a list of the 13 candidate medicines which are responsible for drug-induced liver injury. The commonest one is amoxicillin calvinate, isoniazid, and nitrofurantoin. So what's the pathogenesis of DILI? It is, there are host factors like age, disease, underlying disease, gender, genetics, immune status, and metabolism. Likewise, the drug chemical structure, molecular weight, lipophilicity, dose, and duration of the administration of the agent. Then environmental factor like alcohol, diet, coffee, tobacco, and microbiomes, and also certain toxins in the body. So essentially, DILI is multifactorial in origin. These are the 3 phases of drug which passing through when passing through the liver. The phase 1 where the CYP enzymes act over drug and NADPH will convert into NADP. And reactive metabolites are formed, and these are hepatocytes injury, and they may cause hepatocytes injury and death. Then there is a phase 2 where there is a transferases occur and the conjugation of the drug take place. The agents which are responsible are glucuronide, sulfate, glutathione, methylation take place in the phase 2 transferases, and impairment of this particular transferases will result in drug-induced liver injury. Then there will be a third phase where there is an excretory transporters, and these excretory transporters, if they are defective, then there is another possibility of causing delay. This is the example of classical example of acetaminophen, and acetaminophen is metabolized by conjugation into glucuronide, which is a non-toxic moiety, and likewise sulfase moiety, which is also non-toxic. Its third moiety, which is dose dependent, is N-acetyl P-benzoquinamide, NAPQI. And its NAPQI is toxic, but it is being detoxified by the presence of glutathione. And in overdose, when it is overproduced NAPQI, NAC is given in order to supplement glutathione, which will convert NAPQI into cysteine and mercaptopuric acid conjugates, which are non-toxic. Now let's see how to calculate the R value to classify DILI. DILI is classified into either it is a hepatocellular in origin based upon the liver function, or it is cholestatic, or it is a mixed type. The 2 things are required for this. One is there should be an ALT level of more than 3 times upper limit of normal, and likewise ALP level, which is alkaline phosphatase, more than 2 times upper limit of normal. And if the ratio between the 2 is more than 5, it is hepatocellular. If it is less than 2, then it is cholestasis, and if it is between 2 to 5, then it is mixed type of the liver dysfunction caused by drugs. The diagnosis cascade is fairly extensive. You can see that there is a need for a high index of clinical suspicion is required. There should be a careful history taken, and if the history is positive, then look for the compatible dates of exposure and look into the database like liver tox database, and calculate the R values in order to determine whether it is an hepatocellular type of liver disease or it is mixed variety or cholestatic one. Quite often we will go for evaluation of hepatotropic viruses and non-hepatotropic viruses and autoimmune screening of such individuals. Those who have cholestatic type of liver dysfunction, then to rule out benign and the malignant conditions are required. And ultimately we may consider to have a liver biopsy. So an extensive workup is required in order to diagnose drug-induced liver injury, and it is basically a diagnosis of exclusion. So once we exclude all the likely possibilities, then it is most likely if there's any history of drug exposure, then it is delayed. This is Hy Zimmerman, a major scholar of drug-induced liver injury. He devised a law, which is a rule of thumb that a patient is at a risk of fatal delay if given a medication that cause hepatocellular injury with jaundice. So elevated ALT of threefold and twofold elevation of bilirubin without any underlying cause, and there is an exposure of drugs, it is likely to be delayed. In Zimmerman analysis of original 116 patients of hepatocellular injury and jaundice due to drug exposure, 76% went on to either require a liver transplant or died. Other studies now and the recent one are showing around 10% mortality related to drug-induced liver. This is Rosol-Uclaf causality assessment method and the 7 parameters taking into consideration when calculating whether the patient is having DILI or no DILI. One is the latency course after D-challenge, means after stopping the medication. The risk factors, co-medication, exclusion of the other etiologies, data on drug hepatotoxicity, consultation, and see whether that drug fit into that particular data, and re-challenge if it is being done. So if the overall score is more than 8, it is highly likely that the patient is suffering with DILI. If it is less than 2, then it is unlikely. In the middle, there will be probable and the possible etiological factors suspecting that it is DILI. The other tool for the diagnosis of DILI is, which is upcoming, is the biomarkers. There are some traditional markers, which are basically the liver function tests. There are genetic testing and a long panel of a large panel of genetic testing material. Likewise, there are serum markers, histological markers also there. Omics and metabolomics technologies are also under investigation, and likewise microRNA. So there is a lot of things which are upcoming as far as the biomarkers are concerned for the diagnosis of drug-induced liver injury. But at the moment, there is their predictive value is limited with certain inherent deficiencies. Thus, perhaps the greatest benefit would be achieved by simultaneously combining the scoring system and some assistance from the biomarkers at the moment. What are the clinical features of DILI? They are basically non-specific, but the development of jaundice, encephalopathy, and coagulopathy are the 3 major symptoms of such patients. Otherwise, they are suffering with malaise, anorexia, abdominal pain, and fatigue. Coagulopathy often precedes encephalopathy, but there is essentially no characteristic feature that differentiate DILI ALF from other causes of ALF. However, there are 2 things which are almost always there, that the onset of encephalopathy in such patient is subacute, and there is a history of drug exposure. This is published last year in New England Journal of Medicine, where they have given classical examples of 4 agents and how they will cause drug-induced liver injury, their latent period, and their natural course. The first example is of IV amiodarone single injection. On the very subsequent day, there is the elevation of ALT and bilirubin. There is a normal alkaline phosphatase level. Likewise, in patients who were exposed to diclofenac after more than a month exposure, then there is an elevation of bilirubin and ALT levels, but the alkaline phosphatase will remain within a normal limit, and it subsides within next 4 to 10 weeks time. Cholestatic hepatitis due to cefazolin. Soon after the single injection, there is an elevation of bilirubin, alkaline phosphatase, and ALT. And then in subsequent 3 to 4 weeks time, they start normalizing. Finally, a bland cholestasis due to anabolic steroid after 3 months exposure. During that time, the all liver functions were normal, but soon after stopping the steroids, there is a marked elevation in bilirubin. There is some elevation in alkaline phosphatase, and there is some fluctuating level of ALTs. So the drug-induced liver injury clinical cause is approximately 10% patient with DILI progress to acute liver failure leading to death or liver transplantation. 5 to 20% patients with DILI have persistent abnormality at 6 months. Cirrhosis as a result of DILI is rare but described and can be associated with decompensated disease and liver deaths among those in the liver deaths months to years after DILI is recognized, but it's uncommon. So DILI associated ALF tends to occur in younger adults, more commonly in women than men. Only 15% were older than 60 years of age, and on admission, 68% had either grade 2 or higher encephalopathy, and 25% had clinically detectable ascites, jaundice, and other features of decompensation. How to manage? Stop the culprit drug. Maybe some benefit of giving N-acetylcysteine is a specific benefit in acetaminophen-induced injury, but for otherwise it is not much of value, but can be tried. Corticosteroid can also be used. There is some evidence of beneficial effect of ursodeoxycholic acid, Celimiren, and there is some limited availability of a specific antidote like carnitine for valproic acid and cholestyramine for levofuramide toxicity. But the mainstay in the management is the primary prevention, which provides the maximum benefit. Let's share our own data, which we have collected from the hospitalized patient with a discharge diagnosis of drug-induced liver injury. We came across of 945 cases. Out of those, 295 were excluded because they have chronic liver disease as an underlying cause, and 151 excluded because of acetaminophen-induced injury, and 37% excluded on because they are having some other hepatic lesions. We ended up with 462 DILI cases. Out of these, 30% were having a definitive or high probability of DILI on, and there are 62% who have a probability on the basis of the Roux-Clef score, and there is 7% with a possible diagnosis of DILI on the basis of Roux-Clef score. This is a pattern of the liver function: hepatocellular in 28%, cholestatic in majority, which is 62%, and a mixed variety in 10%. The spectrum of symptoms are altered mental state, altered abdominal pain, vomiting, jaundice, and pruritus. So this is a usual spectrum of DILI symptomatology. The underlying cause is most likely in 2/3 of patient is antituberculous. The remaining include herbal and antiarrhythmic, statin, antibiotics other than antituberculous, and anti-epileptic. But in our series, 2/3 cases were having antituberculous drugs. There is high mortality related to severity and in male gender in hospitalized patient in our setup. So we conclude that there is a antituberculous drugs are seen to be the most frequent cause, and there is a need for awareness among the healthcare professional, specifically when prescribing antituberculous drugs, that they are potentially liver toxic. So what's the way forward? There is a high index of clinical suspicion is required for the diagnosis of DILI. Awareness should be created among physicians for early diagnosis and avoiding of the potential harmful agents. Biomarkers are and the role of gut microbiota is coming up. So maybe in near future we will see that there is a gut-liver axis and its contribution in the pathogenesis of DILI. Likewise, the biomarker research will evaluate further, and we may have certain biomarkers which can predict in near future the outcome and the diagnosis of DILI. Creating a registry for DILI, especially maintaining a list of the agents that are prevalent in our setup, responsible and for DILI, and their outcome will be useful. We are in the process of developing. In fact, we have developed one such database, but so far we have not yet launched it fully, but hopefully from next year to come, we will launch it completely nationwide. And I will stop here and thank you very much for your kind attention. Just to say as a last slide that there is a DILI and network and LiverTalks, the two resources for any kind of reference related to DILI. Finally, there is Sir William Osler's quote that the person who takes medicine must recover twice, once from the disease and the once from the medicine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shahab, for the excellent presentation. And this was the last one we had in this session. And now we move on to the question answers. And I would request all the speakers to please put on their webcams so that we could see them on the screen. And I'll start asking questions which have been posted until now. First, questions are from Dr. Nadeem Tihami, please. And the first question was from Dr. Saeed Hamid that how robust is the IgG4 testing? Do you think what cutoffs are satisfactory? And nowadays it's a trend that every patient who has IgG4 rise is labeled as IgG4 related disease. Is it the right way to do it, or there should be a different approach?
It's a great question. We should not be asking for IgG4 level in every patient who comes in with dubious diagnosis. So simple basic history, clear history, good radiological examination, looking for other features, systemic features, because it is a systemic disease. And one of the slides I had was that we should not be working in specialties isolation. So collaboration with other colleagues, with immunologists and rheumatologists is important. So one, we should not be asking for IgG4 level in every patient. We should be looking at other features. If you're looking at the blood tests, so possibility of raised eosinophil counts, raised IgG-E level, then low complement levels. So if there are other features, then yes, we can ask for IgG4. Serum IgG, so IgG4 levels 2 times the upper limit of a normal are helpful, and we know higher the value, the specificity increase, not the sensitivity. Then what matters is the actual serum IgG4 and IgG ratio. Now that is not a validated tool. What is a validated tool is that when we take a biopsy, and on the biopsy, if there are plasma cells, and if those cells then stain positive on immunohistochemistry, they're stained positive for IgG4, then those plasma cells which are IgG4 positive compared to those who are IgG positive, and if the ratio of IgG4 positive over IgG positive cells is more than 40%, that would point toward the diagnosis of autoimmune IgG4 related disease. So not requesting IgG4 patients in every case, please. We should not be asking in every case, and we should not be making a diagnosis of IgG4 related disease just because the patient has elevated IgG4 related disease. In one of the cases that I shared, patient's IgG4 level was normal. So what we know that IgG4 level can be normal and patient can still have IgG4 related disease, or a patient may have IgG4 related then other disease processes, PSC, malignant processes, cholangiocarcinoma. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. And continuing on the same diagnosis, question by Dr. Amjad Salamat, that what are the cutoff values for IgG4 and IgG and IgG4 ratios for different presentations of IgG4 disease, or there is only one cutoff?
So we only talked about the HPB cluster. So there are other clusters, there are 3 other clusters, but we are focusing mainly on the HPB. And HPB etiology mostly is with autoimmune pancreatitis, and so the 3 subclasses in the HPB cluster, one is IgG autoimmune pancreatitis, one is IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis, and IgG4 hepatopathy. We don't know if IgG4 hepatopathy exists. So then we are left with autoimmune pancreatitis and IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis. Now, even the IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis is usually seen as a manifestation of autoimmune pancreatitis. And we've seen patients who will initially present with autoimmune pancreatitis, and then they go on to develop IgG4 related sclerosing cholangitis. So I think it all comes down to just IgG4 related HPB, and that is mainly the autoimmune pancreatitis. And in that case, as I said, on the serum values 2 times above the upper limit of normal, and on histology, plasma cell cutoff of IgG4 over IgG ratio of more than 40. If you're purely looking at the plasma cells, then under the high power field, our histopathologists usually want more than 100 IgG4 positive cells under high power field. I hope that answered the question.
Excellent. And the third question is, what should be the duration of maintenance treatment in these patients with steroids?
Again, from the experience, all I can tell you that so once we start them on steroids, we continue them on steroids for at least 3 months. So induction with slowly weaning them off for at least 3 months. So now that's different from any other disease process that we deal with. So when we talk about autoimmune hepatitis, we want to sort of gradually wean this off, and you want to bring the azathioprine in as per the EASL guidelines. But in this disease process, you've got to continue them for at least 3 months for the induction treatment. And then in some cases, you sometimes have to carry on for 6 months. Now, the maintenance treatment, as I showed you that randomized controlled trial, which was an underpowered study and closed early, but what they did in one group, they carried them on for 26 weeks and then stopped it. And the other group had it for 3 years. And in the group where they had treatment for 3 years, their relapse-free remission was better than the other group where the treatment was discontinued after 26 weeks. So I think the advice that we give, or the practice that we have, once we start them, we continue them for at least for 3 months. We also do an imaging follow-up to see if the disease process is improving or not improving. And once you've kept them on, like the case I shared initially, the girl, we gave her for about 4 months and then we stopped it. She didn't want to go on to the immunosuppression because she was trying to conceive. And I've been following her up now for almost 3 years, and she's been absolutely fine. So we don't really know which patient, this is what I said. So in terms of our knowledge gap, that's where our knowledge gap is. We don't know who will relapse and who will not relapse, and who should go into immunosuppression and who should not go into immunosuppression. Should we really give them azathioprine, or should we go straight for the rituximab? So patients with a very high value to begin with are the one who will relapse, and those are the group of patients I discuss with them, and if they're up for it, then we go straight from steroids to rituximab. And in terms of, it's given every 6 months, and how do we make a decision whether to continue or not continue it is usually based if they are initially IgG4 related disease, IgG4 levels positive. But then you have to give them maybe a break for 6 months or a year and see what actually happens. There are a few who will have no problem. Now, we've got about sort of 24 patients in our practice who have been following in this center for the last 3 years. They're doing really well, apart from 2 who had an early relapse, but on rituximab, they're very well maintained. But we don't, so the clinic that we have is every 6 months, we have a clinic with immunologist and rheumatologist. So I see them on monthly basis, but otherwise I see them once with a rheumatologist and immunologist every 6 months as well.
Thank you. And another question, have you been using budesonide in this category of patients ever before?
No, so no, we haven't used the budesonide. Again, I don't know the data. I don't think anybody has really studied it in IgG4 related disease. So the answer is no, I haven't.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tehami. And we have a question for Dr. Saad, that what should be the approach in patients with asymptomatic people with autoimmune hepatitis not meeting the treatment criteria, that is activity index less than 4/18?
Yeah, just the best option is to follow them up. Okay, just we have to check them, the LFTs, at least every 3 months for a year, and then every 6 months later on, just waiting for any activity so we can treat them. Otherwise, if no significant activity, so it's the issue of risk-benefit for treatment side effects and the sequelae of their very mild disease. So usually we don't treat them unless you meet the criteria of treatment.
And second question, Dr. Saad, that should we be treating patients with decompensated cirrhosis with steroids of autoimmune hepatitis?
Very good question, yeah. We depend only on the activity, mainly on ALT level. If ALT level is high, so it's denoting that there is still a liver reserve and still there is an activity or inflammation. So those patients might benefit of steroids, but of course we should be very careful about infections, especially SBB. But yes, you can treat them, and I saw many patients who are recompensated after initiating treatment with steroids when it was even for transplant list. And they delisted with steroids, and they showed very good response. So the answer is yes. We depend mainly on the activity and mainly on ALT level, regardless of the liver condition.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Saad, and I hand over to Dr. Kareem. He wants to participate.
I think the session was wonderful, and the questions answer levels were pretty fine, and particularly the last question to Dr. Saad was really interesting, the answer that he gave, that even in a decompensated state we can still treat them with steroid if the SGPT is raised. Similarly, the session in regard to Dr. Shahab Abed and Dr. Masood Sadiq was also very interesting, and I think Dr. Masood Sadiq has really put his level best in a very short time the importance of these two, although uncommon but pretty much their disease like PBC and PSC, and he really emphasized the importance of early MRCP and MRI and FibroScan, particularly in evaluation of PBC. As regard Dr. Shahab, I think Dr. Shahab has excellently elaborated the DILI, the clinical perspective and clinical presentation. So I think if there is no other question, Sadat, I think we can conclude this session.
Sure, should be. Thank you very much, and we'll have a break after this, and we'll be getting back at 2 p.m. Inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you.
We thank all the speakers and the chairs who have participated in this session. Thank you.